Before we get started, the staff and I would like to make this acknowledgement. We acknowledge and honor the land upon which we gather today as the ancestral territory of the Lenni Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania still continues. We take this moment to recognize the original stewards of this land and the histories of violence and erasure that have brought us here today. Okay, I'm happy to report that we have among our attendees today many people who are new to our network and new to the center. So I'm going to take a few seconds before I introduce Linda and turn the day over to her to just talk for a second about the center and our work. So the center is a multidisciplinary grants maker funding in the 5-county Philadelphia region. We have two major platforms for our grants. One is projects in performance and in exhibitions and public interpretation. Those categories are very broadly conceived. And we also have a fellowships program, an individual artist fellowships program that is over 30 years old now. We invest up to $10 million, sometimes a little more, in arts and culture in our region. And we do it in the service of artists and arts organizations of diversity, distinction, and substance. We also want to raise the visibility of Philadelphia as a place where there is a very dynamic cultural community. So grant making is our primary work, but the center also has a kind of secondary arm, and that is we function as a hub for dialogue around issues that are critical to cultural practice. This work is a kind of capacity building effort on our parts that is meant to connect our colleagues in the community, to their peers around the world and nationally. We also hope this work makes a contribution to the fields that we serve that goes beyond the grant dollars. So to that end, we produce publications with new scholarship, we present lectures, symposia, and organize other kinds of convenings and engagements that explore relevant topics of the moment. As part of that work, we also have a visiting artists and scholars program for which we invite a distinguished practitioner to be in residence with us over a protracted period and to focus through a variety of activities that they design and conceive on an issue of particular urgency. And it occurs to me, since so many of you are new to us, that you may be interested in subscribing, and I suggest that you do subscribe to our newsletter to learn about events like this one, as well as a lot of other really interesting information, interviews, essays from cultural practitioners, and news about arts and culture. So we're going to drop that link in the chat if you are interested in signing up. Okay, so in 2021, the focus of our Visiting Scholars program is on Black cultural production, and we are delighted to have been working on this topic with our colleague and today's moderator and our visiting scholar this year, Linda Earle. For those of you who don't know her, Linda has worked in the arts as an educator, administrator, funder, and curator, and as an advocate for inclusion, freedom of expression, and the development of new platforms for cultural practice, participation, and discourse. She is the professor of practice in fine arts management and the associate graduate director for the Arts Management MA at Tyler School of Art at Temple University. Before joining Tyler's faculty, Linda served as executive director of the Great Lakes Colleges Association's New York Arts Program, which was an academic and professional development semester for undergraduates. She was director of the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture from 1999 to 2009, and a senior program director at the New York State Council on the Arts, where the Individual Artist Program was founded under her leadership. Linda has taught film and cultural studies at Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers, at Hunter College, and at Barnard College, and has served on numerous grants and commissioning panels and artist advocacy groups. She's served on the College Art Association's Awards Committee for Distinction and Diversity, and on the boards of several arts and culture and service organizations. As a writer, she's held residencies at Hedgebrook and the Writers' Room, and has collaborated in many creative and curatorial projects over the years. I'm really delighted to turn the day over to Linda and to our distinguished guest today, especially at the end of what's been quite another momentous week in the United States of America. So Linda, I'm going to turn off my camera. I'll be back at the end to say goodbye and thanks, but very much looking forward to our conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Paula, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the staff of the center as well for supporting the continuation of this conversation, especially a conversation that connects the past to the future in such complex and telling ways. As Paula said, this has been a roller coaster week in the realm of racial justice, a traumatizing journey. I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that and to say that one of the ways that we deal with oppression and injustice is the kind of work you'll be hearing about today and the kind of conversation we're having. But it's also important to note its toll on all of us. And I want to thank the staff at the Pew Center for asking me the question I was asking myself about whether we should proceed or not earlier this week, and offering flexibility if we needed to reschedule. And I'm so glad we're proceeding, and so grateful to today's speakers and for all of you attending. This conversation, I think, is in many ways perhaps more important than ever, and it's one that acknowledges tremendous challenges, but also offers brilliant examples of reparative work and strategies for moving forward. We're thinking throughout about the structures that shape knowledge, how different forms and expression of knowledge are valued, preserved, and communicated. And it's obvious that digital tools have given us all unprecedented access to information and have the potential for transforming even what access means and the dimensions of access. It's also obvious that the algorithms and platforms that deliver information shape our consumption and communication are not neutral. And our three guests today are among the pioneers, really, who are engaging that duality and helping researchers, students, communities, and the curious navigate them. So I want to introduce them to you now, starting with Faithe J. Day. Faithe received a PhD in communication studies from the University of Michigan, a BA in English and digital humanities from Wesleyan College. As an independent researcher, writer, and digital creative, Dr. Day develops curriculum, data collection, and curation of projects in collaboration with other scholars to identify critical frameworks and best practices to ensure an ethical and justice-centered approach to data curation, with a focus on Black and LGBTQIA+ data and discourse. Dr. Day is also the creator of the Black Living Data Booklet, a manual and manifesto on ethical management of data on and for Black communities. Her work brings greater awareness to the issues of data privacy, ethics, and ownership in developing personal and community-based archives. Thank you for being here, Faithe. Portia D. Hopkins holds a doctorate in American Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park. She is the 2022 Council on Libraries, Information and Research Services Digital Library is it Federation? Yes. Postdoctoral Research Associate in Data Curation for African American Studies at Rice University. where she teaches workshops, conducts outreach about data curation to African American activist groups in Houston, assesses and inventories local data collections as well. And she's currently leading 2 oral history projects, which I hope she'll tell us a bit about today, and working to develop best practices documents on data curation at Rice and across Houston. She's also taught extensively. I also want to thank you for being here, Portia. I want to thank our next guest, Synatra Smith, for inspiring this conversation. We were having a talk and that took off in this direction. And I want to thank her for that and for introducing me to Portia and Faithe. Synatra is a digital humanities cultural anthropologist with a specialization in African American identity and community. She's an emerging museum professional with experience, 5 years experience, and she's conducted research on Black townships in Princess County, Maryland, and on residential segregation in Hyattsville, Maryland, and heritage tourism in Western Africa. She is also a CLIR DLF postdoctoral fellow in data curation for the African American Studies Department at African American Studies at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Library, and Archives, and at Temple, where she's a colleague of mine in working in the library's Loretta C. Duckworth Scholar Studio, which is our digital humanities studio, where she is researching Black artists and collections to update wiki records and generate data visualizations. She is also developing an Afrofuturist interactive virtual reality exhibition experience of Black cultural spaces, including 3D models of actual spaces and objects. And I hope she talks a bit about that. Now I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak about their research and work for about 10 minutes or so. After they do that, I might pose a question or two and let the conversation sort of unfold from there. And make sure I leave enough time for your questions. And I'll keep an eye on questions in the Q&A. And Amako will back me up on that. And I'd like you to start off, Synatra, if you don't mind. Is that okay?
Sure, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I see quite a few people from the Library and Archives at PMA in the attendees list. And so I just wanted to shout them out because the project that I am going to begin talking about with the Wikidata records is definitely, I got into this work because of them. They trained me on how to edit Wikidata, what Wikidata is, what linked open data is, all of that, and really set things up for me to be able to do this project. So I'll back up a bit first and explain how I kind of came to the work that I'm doing. I am a CLIR fellow, and so this is an entire fellowship about data curation and African American studies. And prior to that, I was working at a small local Black museum in Prince George's County, Maryland, called the Prince George's African American Museum and Cultural Center. There I was doing a lot of local research on Black communities. It's the richest jurisdiction of Black folks in the country, but there's definitely a lot of, there's a spectrum of socioeconomic status within Prince George's County. So we were researching all of this history and doing collections, outreach programs and everything. And then I ended up being awarded with this amazing fellowship. And so the work, I'm gonna share my screen. All right, and start my presentation. So I am doing let me move that out of the way. Black Artist Data Curation through Wikidata project with PMA and Temple University Libraries. And this project helps ensure the digital visibility of African-American artists who have lived in or were born in Philadelphia. And the reason why I focused on this particular group is because I really did enjoy doing that local research at that previous museum. And so I wanted to kind of keep that as I continue to move forward. So what I'm doing is I'm researching any missing information from these artists' Wikidata records, which is a linked open data platform that is within the Wiki universe, similar to Wikipedia and everything. And so this is really important because when you are Googling sculptors who are Black and have exhibited at PMA, the way that that information comes up is through, or one of the ways that that information can come up is through Wikidata. The Google is connected to Wikidata. It'll research, it'll look through that database and find all of that information. And I'll talk about queries in a little bit. So this is giving a greater amount of digital visibility in that regard. In order to do this work, you do have to have a reference URL. So most of the research that I'm doing is through traditional analog books, but you need a link in order to reference things on Wikidata. So what I'm doing is I'm blogging about the artist, making sure that all that information is in there, and then kind of telling whatever story I find most interesting about them, pretty much. And then I'm linking that information through Wikidata. So I'll update the missing birthday or the missing a location that they lived or something like that. And then I'll put the link to the blog as the reference URL. And then that has all of my citations. So you can actually see where that information came from if it wasn't the internet. There are a couple of limitations to using Wikidata. One is that in order to identify the race or ethnicity, you have to use the term African American, which is not the same as Black. So we've been doing a lot of discussions at PMA about whether or not we wanted to make a transition from focusing on African Americans to focusing on Black so that we can include the entire diaspora, which is wonderful, but Wikidata does not necessarily allow me to do that in an explicit way, at least. And then the other limitation is that it's completely open source. So your data can evolve over time. You may have put something in there and then someone can come behind you and take it out. But there are discussion pages where you can talk to editors about what's going on. You can change things back. So it's just kind of the nature of the beast. So this jumble of characters is a Sparkle query. So with Wikidata, there's a database where you can query the database. That doesn't make any sense. You can query the Wikidata database using a coding language called Sparkle. And so these are two Sparkle queries that I wrote. One of them is, as you can see at the top, all artists who live in Philadelphia with their birthplace, gender, and race and ethnicity. So it'll query the database for anyone who has lived in Philly, and then bring in that information about birthplace, gender, and race and ethnicity into a spreadsheet. And then the other one is the same information coming in, but only focusing on anyone who's also labeled as, with their race and ethnicity as African American. So this is the existing data. This is what is already in there right now. This may change over time. I'm doing a lot of work on this data. So as of right now, 26% of all of the individuals who have their occupation listed as artists or a subclass of artists, they've resided in Philadelphia and they're labeled as African American. Of all of those who are in that group, only 26% are labeled as African American. So we can already see that there's definitely a lack here. That doesn't necessarily mean that everyone, if we compiled all of the artists in Philadelphia, that only 26% are Black, it just means that that's what's in Wikidata. And then I also wanted to look at, this is a really quick and dirty data visualization that's through the Wikidata database of the gender distribution. And so one of the things that stood out to me about this and with the collection that I'm working with is that there's an imbalance when it comes to gender. Non-binary folks are not represented at all. And then there's a limited amount of female African-American artists. So this work is really important because it allows you an opportunity to see what types of connections you have between institutions and also gain an understanding of your collection strengths and weaknesses. And that can be identified by capturing has works in collections. So if you're looking at doing a Romare Bearden show. Maybe your collection doesn't have too many, but you're able to look on that on his Wikidata page and find out that there are certain institutions that you may have already wanted to collaborate with, and this is the perfect opportunity because they all have his works in their collection as well. Okay, so as I'm doing all of this work, I'm at the same time working with the Scholar Studio at Temple to do a virtual reality project where I've made a 3D model of Harriet's Bookshop, which is located in the Fishtown area of Philadelphia. So I'm going to show a video that walks you through, and while since it's a minute long, I'll talk during the video as well, so we can all, chew gum and walk at the same time. So what I had to do here was go to Harriet's Bookshop, take measurements of everything, get a lot of pictures, and then learn how to use 3D modeling software. I was inspired by some of the work that's being done with the externs who are at Temple and that work with us in the Scholar Studio. We have a meeting every Friday. We just had our last one earlier today, as a matter of fact. And I was also at the same time watching Lovecraft Country and was like, oh my gosh, what if this was a virtual reality thing? So I've kind of evolved a little bit past doing a horror thing because I'm not really into horror anyways. I'm a little bit too terrified. But what I am going to do is fill the space with artwork that is, or with items that are in the collections of PMA, the Bloxon collection. I've been talking to Mural Arts, and so I'm going to re-engage with them about some things that I have in mind for this space. But basically, you'll be able to put on a VR headset or do the web version of the VR experience and go into it and interact with the objects that are there. I'll be doing oral histories, so there'll be a lot of interactivity. I've also been blessed with a wonderful idea to use portals where you can go into a mirror, go into another world and come out. And so I'm going to be doing some things with photogrammetry and sculptures in Philadelphia there. So more on that to come later when I have things to share about that.
Thank you so much, Synatra. It's mind-blowing possibilities there. Thank you. Portia.
I don't even know how you follow that. I think we're done for the day. Synatra is amazing. Every time I talk to her, I'm in awe and inspired. So my project really focuses on community archives and the work that they're doing with Rice University. And my background in historic preservation really allowed me to jump into this work and build on the research that I had already done. So my dissertation is on historic preservation in historically African-American communities. And so with my dissertation, I did a lot of oral histories. I ended up really becoming like embedded into the community. At one point, when I was like looking for housing, I was like, I guess I'm going to go live in Lakeland now because everybody's grandma says that I can live with them. So I think I'm going to go and live with my my community and just be one with my research. And so my background at Maryland really prepared me for the work that I was doing. And initially, this wasn't even the main project that I was working on. Initially, I was building curriculum for HISD and Round Rock ISD because Texas, to give you a little bit of context, Texas just now, last year, has African American studies as an option for the core curriculum for high schoolers. And so, which was great. It was a really good project, but also they didn't have any resources to put forth with that project. And so I was working with the social studies coordinator at HISD to create some of this curriculum. And in October, I actually got an email from my supervisor asking if I would consult on this project for oral history, because originally the project was about environmental racism and the toxicity within the community. And they were also looking at Hurricane Harvey. And so it was a class project that was from a course that was team taught by two Rice University faculty members. And because of COVID, the project actually moved online. And so in October, they were looking for somebody that could come and consult and do some oral histories with some of the community members. And I just lit up when I found out that I was going to be able to do this, because of two things. One, I just really enjoy talking to my elders. Like, I was raised with my grandparents. And so I just find that to be very therapeutic and like rewarding for me as a person. But then also, I just love storytellers. And every time you get into an oral history, you know, people just really engage with you and connect with you. And it's this really like intimate and often emotional experience. And so I was so thankful for the opportunity to be able to do that. And so starting in October, we were doing like these Zoom interviews where we would sometimes go and have somebody help set up the technology for the people in the community so that they could do this Zoom interview. I did several interviews over the phone because people just were not comfortable with the technology. And because Pleasantville is a community that was historically segregated, it was founded in 1948. And it was really a community that was supposed to just be this like idealist, picturesque place for African Americans to go after World War II. And in talking to the first and second and now third generation Pleasantville residents, they talk about this community as being also a place where they can be protected and that was away from the white gaze. And so they had already started a community heritage project prior to them starting to work with Rice University. Now, Rice University, you know, is a very prestigious university in Houston. They have a $6.2 billion endowment. Like, these are big dogs, so to speak, right? And so in partnering with Rice University, initially there was some hesitation from some of the community members, because on the one hand, they had been doing this project themselves. And in doing the project for themselves, they really felt like they had the ability to have this authentic narrative, and that they had the ability to be agents for that narrative. And so they wanted to have the space to create a platform for themselves to talk about their history, but then they also were very protective of a history that prior to the work that they were doing with Rice was really kind of socially isolated to the African American community. And so what I've found to be very interesting is the intersection between the institution sharing their resources with communities of color and Black communities, traditionally marginalized communities, and then also the communities now trying to figure out, how do we bring in these stakeholders in an authentic way, but then also ensure that we still have the agency and the ability to control our narrative. So the community is very interested in telling their own stories on their own terms. And so this is why, you know, oral history has been such a rewarding experience for the community to engage, because we're teaching the community members to do the oral histories. And so they've created now these story circles. And then what we do at Rice is after we do the oral histories, we'll do all of the transcription for them. We'll put the project together, put this thing online. And what I've started to do now is look for additional sources in our archives at Rice, and then also at some of the archives around the city. And so I will share my screen. I just had, there was just two that I wanted to share with you. And one of them actually came out yesterday. I was waiting and waiting and waiting for the scan. And they were able to scan it for me yesterday. And I was so excited. I was like, this is perfect, because I definitely want to share this at my talk tomorrow. And so remember, I had mentioned that Pleasantville was, I think this is my, if I do that, can you see it? Yeah. Pleasantville was founded in 1948. And it was founded actually by some Jewish residential developers. And they sold this community as an idealistic picturesque community for African Americans. And so there were apartments and there were also homes in the background. And so you actually see this on the Houston Home Builders Monthly magazine from 1951. And this is Pleasantville, a city of low-cost apartments and homes for Negroes. And so, you know, when we're doing this work, of course, the community doesn't remember it being marketed this way, right? The community has a completely different, memory of how Pleasantville was talked about on the larger landscape. And so when we're looking at now the things that we have already in the archive about Pleasantville that coincidentally, they're not in an archive for that's specifically marked for Pleasantville. It's actually an archive that was from the Jewish Studies Center. And so a lot of this stuff actually came from the Jewish Studies Center, and it just by happenstance, we found it because we were looking for something else. And then also the other ad is from 1955. And so this was actually in the Houston Post, but we had other African-American our magazines and newspapers that we're finding now evidence of Pleasantville being advertised. And so often it would say things like this, right? It's a truly pleasant community for my family. They would really sell you on the fact that it's family centered. There's an elementary school here. There's a park here. But then when we looked at other ads, they were also talking about the extracurricular activities that were there, the baseball for the kids, the community park that they built, and then also that it was a faith-based community. And one of the claims to fame for Pleasantville is that they have had in most elections 100% voter participation. And so this was something that they're incredibly proud of. It's come out in every single one of the oral histories that I've done, that they've had 100% voter participation in most of the elections in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that they were incredibly influential in getting a lot of policy at the city level passed because they had that voting power. And so, you know, as we are working towards collecting these stories and housing these stories at Rice, we're also, you know, using this as an opportunity to heal because, you know, Rice has had a reputation in Houston as being unobtainable and being kind of like this abstract, you know, Shangri-La over here in the museum district. And so often when communities will partner with universities, Rice is not the first place that they would go. And so now Rice has really been forward thinking and intentional about trying to encourage communities across the city to work with them, and that Rice wants to share their resources with these communities so that it's not this tension and this distance that we've historically had. So right now in our project, we have collected 17 oral histories. We have 4 that are currently online, and then we have like another 8 that are in the chute to be online, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And I'm meeting with the community organizers next week because we're planning to put in a application for a SALA, so that this year their theme is the Black family. And another theme that has come out a lot in the oral histories that I've done is the role of the Black father in Pleasantville in the 50s and 60s. And so the community is very interested in putting together either a poster or doing a panel discussion at a SALA. And they're also doing a digital mapping project that we've partnered with some of the other Rice faculty on. And we've hired a fellow at Circle to help do some of the archival research so we could continue to build this documentary history that we have housed at Rice, but wasn't necessarily directly related to Pleasantville and wasn't organized in that way. And so now we're also creating these new like lib guides that will tell you about Pleasantville and the history of African Americans in Houston, using Pleasantville as like the case study. And so, our project is very much in its infancy in the sense that we're building relationships. And so I anticipate that by the end of my fellowship, we will have a very robust oral history collection, a very robust archival collection, and that, that trust will be regained and reestablished between the institution and the community, right? But of course, it's a work in progress, and it really does start with having authentic conversations and having a genuine curiosity about the subject, and then also making sure that we are magnifying the voices of the people that are telling these stories. And so, like, when I do the oral history, I'm like, I am literally just the vessel. Like, you're telling me this and I'm recording it. And then there's a lot of, checks and balances, making sure that if you are comfortable with putting this online, then we'll put it online. And if you're not, then we can edit it or re-record it. Like, you definitely are the person that are in charge of this narrative. And I think that that is incredibly empowering to a community of people who historically have been marginalized, whose stories have not been told in a holistic and positive way. And so to give the community that opportunity to say, here are resources, here are the fellows and the graduate students to work with you. You tell us how you want this to be shaped. That has been very rewarding. And the last little bit I just want to mention, because this project with BLM-HTX, Black Lives Matter Houston, is just picking up again, because as you know, it has been a chaotic 2 years. And so I just reached back out to them and got correspondence back from them on Tuesday about starting their oral history and collecting and starting to talk about the ways in which the birth of BLM-HTX in Houston is actually a Black love story, right? It's a social justice project, but it's also a Black love story, and it's a movement for Black lives. And so hopefully next time I talk to you and I get a chance to talk to you, I'll be able to share more about that project as well.
Thank you, Portia. You're both talking about transforming institutional relationships with the community in a way that's really exciting and labor intensive and rich. Faithe, please tell us about your work.
Yes.
Oops.
It's going to be interesting. Hello.
Hi, you were freezing a little bit.
Making sure I'm still here. Yeah, so this would be interesting to kind of see this sort of a bit of a juxtaposition in how we're thinking about working with institutions. So I'm going to share my screen. And then view and present. So the project that I want to talk about today is the Black Living Data Booklet, which is defined for me as both a manual and a manifesto, kind of thinking about the ethical engagement of data on and for Black communities. And primarily it's a digital humanities project that sort of works with looking at both art and activism through different sort of multimedia formats. So currently I've had the project hosted on my website. So if you want to check it out, it's at fjday.com. And it includes different gallery images. I've also created cell phone wallpapers, infographics, and an open access sort of printable version of the booklet itself. But before I discuss that, we were asked the question, how did I come to this work? And so for me, as kind of millennial and digital native, I feel like I was also kind of a born digital humanist. The first class that I ever took in college was called Digital Humanities. And after that class, I immediately went into self-designing a major based on the field. And so my academic career really began with this sort of interest in digital projects, art and design, social media, and especially cultural critique. And so my first digital project was called the Hypertext Nabokov. And it was actually based on Vladimir Nabokov's personal archives and the way that he archived his creative work and how it was taken up. And at the same time, I was also working in the student archives of my college library. Well, I was a Haystack Scholar, and Haystack stands for Humanities, Arts, Science, and Technology Alliance and Collaboratory. And so for many years, I was kind of blogging and writing about my work within that platform. And then I got my PhD in communication and media at the University of Michigan, and that's where I began actually doing research, primarily on Black and queer YouTube web series, which sparked my interest in thinking about social media data and the creation and curation of cultural productions, especially from marginalized communities. And of course, similar to the other panelists, I then started my CLIR postdoc after leaving Michigan. And so I was a CLIR fellow in data curation for African American studies. And so I think I'm the first cohort, and then Synatra and Portia, I think, are in the second cohort. And so within the first cohort, we were sort of tasked with this idea of doing work that spoke to the relationship between data science and Black studies. And in particular, we were asked, what can Black studies teach us about data and information science? So for me, over the course of the fellowship, I really focused on writing and speaking on that topic, which is, of course, then what developed into the Black Living Data booklet. And so to explain a little bit more about the booklet itself and the work that I feel like I've been doing with it, as a manifesto, the BLDB is a collection of statements that I have written about the importance of engaging with media, information, and data in ways that are more conscious, especially of the history and harms of data collection and analysis, specifically for Black communities. And so some of the principles that I outline in the booklet is the importance of recognizing that data is not just sort of objective numerical findings, but that data is actually creating stories about communities, and that communities have the power, especially to counter the findings of data science through the creation of their own stories. And so in thinking about numbers and my own research, I was also very committed to doing work that could be considered small data research. And so the Black Living Data booklet is really demonstrating that bigger isn't always better when it comes to data collection, and that data is never too small to count. The booklet is built on a feminist ethics of care, about researching communities, which is really exemplifying a more intersectional approach to working with information and individuals. And I think that the project itself is really modeling how researchers, students, archivists, librarians, and of course, community members can engage in more critical and care-filled approaches to data collection, curation, and critique. And for me, a lot of this work was inspired by the essay Black Data, which was written by Shaka McGlatten. And McGlatten writes that I use Black data to think through some of the historical and contemporary ways that Black queer people, like other people of African descent and people of color more broadly, are hailed by big data, through which techniques of race and racism reduce our lives to mere numbers. And I think here McGlatten really calls us into an understanding of Black queer practices, which actually deconstruct data as a purely numerical concept by providing examples that actually focus on both art and archives. And I think that caring for and about Black data, and especially Black living data, is then a push to understand the kind of intersections within the Black communities and embracing all of the different identities that are included and inherent to the diaspora, as well as their many cultural productions. And in my writing, I'm always thinking about how we can include sort of Black queer practices and frameworks to our understanding of culture and collections, as well as digital tools and technology. And so some of the big questions that I've been focused on recently and working on newer projects, especially as we look into the future, is, what does it actually look like to work independently of institutions? And this question for me was really inspired by students that I had last year who really didn't view archives as institutional, but really saw themselves as digital archivists and cultural creators based on the way that they actually interacted with the internet and social media. And so especially now that we're sort of living in a world where we are encouraged to curate our feed and collect data on ourselves, what is an archive for an individual or community? And then I think another question I've been thinking about is, how are we reframing our understanding of then who has access to the role of archivist or creator? And especially the idea of being a curator. And so in utilizing the Black Living Data booklet then as a manual, I think that it's an excellent resource for anyone who wants to do sort of archival or curatorial work, because the booklet contains these different exercises, which I call demonstrations, that actually teach the principles of collection, curation, and critique. And through these different demonstrations, I view the booklet as a resource that can help influence our understanding of data collection and creation as not just something that only researchers and institutions do, but as something that is actually accessible to many different groups. And in this sense, giving example of how we can actually all curate our own archives of information and collect data about ourselves and our communities. And in this sense, using that to sort of counter whatever kind of negative stories may be being kind of put out by technology corporations, platforms, institutions, and other systems of oppression. So in looking at kind of some examples from the booklet itself, these are kind of a couple of pages that I sort of pulled to think about the different demonstrations. So this is a demonstration for community data. And so this gives examples of how people can think about curating their own community archives through making ethnographies, mapping, and some other types of data curation techniques. Another demonstration that I also include in the booklet is the idea of a data diary. So using a journal or a daily diary to collect information on yourself, and especially your daily relationship to information and media. I think this is really important, especially as the media kind of focuses so much on Black death and despair and negative statistics and data, that I think it's important for me to make sure that people are kind of checking in with themselves and their communities about the effects of this. And as someone with kind of a communication background, I think a lot about media effects, and especially the consumption of news media, and the serious psychological toll that it actually takes on you to hear these stories. And so I think we all need to be more cognizant of that. And the data diary is kind of one demonstration that shows you how you can think more critically about that type of information and consuming it and what it does for individuals and communities. And then finally, the Black Living Data booklet is actually accompanied by a secondary project that I created called the COVID Confessions, which is an example of how you can utilize community archives or personal archives to create sort of artistic renderings of a collection. And so the COVID Confessions is actually a collection of recordings, images, and written work from my own writings and reflections from the first month of social distancing and the current pandemic. And this project is actually hosted on SoundCloud as a spoken word album of the different parts of my own personal and familial archives and ancestry work. And so during the beginning of COVID, I started to get really interested in sort of collecting narrative, doing my own kind of oral histories with my family. And so there's a bit of that in this COVID Confessions work, and kind of giving this as an example of the type of work that individuals can do maybe with their own families or their own communities, and collecting really interesting reflections, histories, etc. And of course, this is one of many projects. So if you are interested, you can definitely keep up to date with this project at fjday.com, and then my other projects at Faithe Joy Day. And I thank you all for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Faithe. I am really interested in this notion of sort of converting consumption into engagement, and the fact that archives can be incredibly generative as well. So to get our sort of Q&A started off, I thought I'd ask a question that sort of was raised in my mind about elements of all three of your presentations, and that's about new artistic practices and how they're archived, and how the artists involved might be involved in creating their own archives, and that is socially engaged practices, particularly being adopted and adapted by Black artists that involve a lot of community engagement, maybe informed by Black feminists ethics of care, and for example, that are not recognized as art forms necessarily by the standard identifiers and finding aids. And you know, sort of hard to capture because of their scope and their context. And I was wondering how you engage with those practices and what you've observed.
I can speak a little bit to a project that I was working on with BLMHTX and Black Noir, which is a nonprofit in Houston. And one of the things that we did was do a wiki workshop where we would create, we would very similar to what Synatra is doing, in that we were using Wikidata and creating new assignments for students. And so we would create these workshops where the students would research a local Houston artist, and they would update the wiki page about that particular artist. But in order for them to do that, we had to teach the teachers how to teach the students to do the wiki data, right? It's how to edit the wiki page. And so what I found happening was twofold. One, the teachers were now learning about these new artists within the community that they had no idea about, you know. And like, one thing about Houston is a very cultured place. You won't know it, but unless you come here. But like, usually, you know, when people think about Texas, they think about all of these negative things. And when they think about Houston, it's kind of like this flyover place, but actually we're very cultured down here. And there's a lot of artists here that do not have a large presence on the internet, that are not really well known globally, or in some instances they were well known globally and they just weren't known in Houston. And so in doing the workshops and teaching the teachers about the artists and helping them create activities for their students so that the students could learn about the artists, we were bringing in communities, the community engagement. We were bringing in K through 12 educators. We were partnering with different nonprofit organizations. And we were able to do 2 before the freeze, and the freeze happened and everything got thrown off because, again, you know, in Texas, we don't do cold weather very well. So the freeze happened and everything got thrown off. But we were able to do 2 before that. And what I found so rewarding about the process of doing the workshops, but then also the byproduct of it, was that these lesson plans are going to be embedded into the African American history curricula for next year, right? And so something that has always been a resource here, has always been available to us here, that we never categorized as something that we should be teaching the students about, now is embedded into their curriculum. And I just found that to be very rewarding, because there are so many stories that we just don't tell about Houston. And it was just very empowering to hear the teachers light up and talk about how this was going to transform their classroom and help the students think more positively about their neighborhood, their communities, and the city. And so I don't know necessarily if that gets to your question, but when you were talking about, you know, artists and you know, different projects that we're working on, I thought about that, and I just wanted to share that we are doing this work on the ground with BLMHTX.
Yeah, that's great. That's really informative. Anybody else want to take that question and talk a little bit about social practice? Synatra?
Yeah, first I wanted to comment on what Portia was talking about, how they were able to teach the teachers how to teach editing Wikidata. And I think that is so amazing. That's one of the things that I think this pandemic experience has really lent itself to. There's a lot of opportunities to collaborate with folks on digital tools online. We have these 3D modeling and C# working groups at Temple, where we're learning how to do all of this stuff live on a shared screen, Zoom and everything. And so, you know, as horrible as this pandemic has been, that has been the one silver lining that I really do appreciate. And I'm so happy that you all are doing that work down in amazing Houston. I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. Beyonce's from Houston, so I already knew that y'all were.
That's true.
And in terms of the art, non-traditional ways of making art, one of the things that really struck me when I went to visit Harriet's bookshop for the first time, I already figured out that was where I wanted to focus my work. There were two Black bookstores in Philadelphia that I knew about. I won't say the other one since I didn't include it in my project, but I already knew that that was the one I wanted to focus on. And then when I entered the space, I realized how amazing it was. She is really a curator in and of herself, in addition to being a lover of books and having her own bookstore that she started, if not during the pandemic, right before it started. Like, she has been able to make a lot of things happen over the past year that are just phenomenal, to the point where she's now opening a second location called Ida's Bookshop. So Janine is doing amazing things. But when you go into the space, it's filled with art. She told me when I went to take measurements and pictures, she said, you're not going to be upset if the next time you come back, everything is in a different place. Are you? I said, of course not, Janine. This is your store. You do your thing. I'm just, here to make it come to the virtual world. And that is exactly what she does. She moves things around. Someone was delivering a gold telescope while I was going there for the first time. And it's like sitting in the middle of the room in my pictures because it was a day that the store was closed. But I have to go back and see, what did she do with this telescope? But there's art all over the walls. There's a mannequin that's wearing some of her merch. She's got these garment racks in the basement, which is why there were garment racks in there, because that has the merch on it. And I wanted to hopefully figure out a way to include that. But even when you make a purchase, she wraps it up. And I saw her teaching one of her staff members how to do this properly. She wraps it up with twine and then puts some dried flowers. I think when I purchased some books from there, it was dried lavender, but I don't think that that's necessarily the only flower that she's using. And then she's got a signature scent to the space. And so it's just an amazing experience that I'm like trying to figure out, now, how do I do that with VR? I mean, smell, I don't know how I'm gonna tackle that one. I did figure out how to kind of use this VR world to activate her space even more, where I want folks to be able to kind of identify books while they're in the VR space, create a book list, and then purchase those books from her and not Amazon. Love you, Amazon, but we gotta, support Black businesses. So, there's other ways that I'm kind of thinking of how do I kind of give back to the space, but there's some things that she's doing in there that I'm really like, I don't know how I'm going to put plants in there. I know I want to, but I don't know how I'm going to 3D model plants yet, besides just snatching some models off of the internet. But there's a lot for me to consider. So I don't have an answer to the question. It is a question that I'm also thinking about. Yeah.
No, it's we have a comment from Miriam who says Harriet's Bookshop and grand opening was February 2020. Wine and Write event that month was one of the last public things I did in 2020. Still miss the space. I mean, these are I think the space is work of art and a work of her social practice too. So it really does that. Yeah.
And she's even like activated the sidewalk, where she'll have folks come and do performances on the sidewalk during her open hours, so that you can kind of pass some music or something as you're going in to make your purchase. It's amazing.
Yeah. Faithe, you alluded to making art yourself as well. And so could you address the question a little bit?
Yes. The question actually made me think of a couple of different things. Similar to Portia and Synatra comment, the first thing I thought about was the organization FemTechNet and the wikidons that they do, many of them which are focused on actually getting more, in particular, of course, women artists, and in particular, women artists of color into Wikipedia, and making sure that they have entries and giving them that digital visibility that Synatra talked about online. I think is like a big thing that's become really popular over the past years. And another person that I kept thinking about was Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who of course does her own work, but has created this space called Mobile Homecoming, which is a Black and LGBTQ archive of art and music and like film and video and all these different things. And in the creation of that, her creation of it was very much so focused on this idea of like venerating elders in the community and creating a space where you could actually be able to return to work of people who maybe do not have another space to be honored or remembered in that sense. And that's a lot of what I've been thinking about, even in my own work, and thinking about the collection of personal archives and community archives. When I was in college working in the archives, I went to a women's college, and a lot of the work that we would do is many times when a past student would pass on, their children would bring like a box of just things about that person. And the college has done the work of keeping an archive of literally every student who's ever gone there since the 19th century. And I always found it fascinating that they did that regardless of who the student was. So it wasn't, a situation where it's like, oh, this person is famous, or this person did this, we're gonna keep their art. It's like, no, you took a class here in 1925, you can always bring your art back. And I thought that was interesting in thinking about like a feminist ethics of caring, that they always realized at Wesleyan, you were always known, was the phrase. And so this idea of an institution kind of connecting to the community in that way, I think was so interesting and such an example of like what that looks like to do a feminist ethics of caring kind of in practice as an institution.
And Brenda Dixon-Gastchild has written in the chat, she's noted the Colored Girls Museum, which is actually the curated home of Germantown resident Vashti Dubois, very famous place here, and is a living work of art as well. So we have a question from Linda. Faith or others, how do you archive meaningfully while avoiding that sort of, documentation of every life moment that is so voluminous it falls into sort of digital black hole within a fairly short period of time, written, overwhelmed by the amount of data and forgotten? Or is that a false problematic distinction I'm making? Says Linda.
Yes, there's a part of me that does feel like, well, what's wrong with that? And I'm an obsessive, I guess you could say, archiver to some extent, and that's kind of, I feel like, my role within a variety of different communities, to the point that people just give me things. They say, oh, for your archives, here's this thing for the archives, because people know that I'm interested in that, and that's something that I do. And so to some extent, I think that's also the fun of the use of digital tools and technology, right? Now I had, for many years I've kept journals, and I recently started scanning the journals into the computer. So I don't have to keep a bunch of journals, but I can always have this never ending now store of all of that information that I can put into my computer. And so I think that is a bit of the fun of it, is not necessarily making those decisions about, what is the most important thing for me to keep? Because, what does that mean? Who's to say what's going to be important? I mean, we've seen that even now looking at like authors' archives, people like Octavia Butler's archives or Toni Morrison's archives. It all is important to those who love you to some extent, those who are interested in your work. So I like that idea of, more is more, and being able to collect ad infinitum, because that is kind of what the digital allows us to do.
Mm-hmm. And even marginalia turns out to be important in research sometimes. I'm sorry, Synatra.
And it also allows you to develop collaborative projects. So I may not be able to, by my lonesome, digitize everything or create 3D models of everything, but there's all these amazing opportunities that are popping up all over the place. We just have to kind of tap into them and find ways to collaborate, which, another plug for Wikidata, that's how you can figure out, if you've got two institutions that have some things in common or whatever that would lend itself to a collaborative project. So you're able to do that together and figure out ways to store it and not use up all of your Google Drive, as many of us often do. The free space they give us is not enough.
We can take more questions. I want to remind you to put your questions in the Q&A because we can't see raised hands. So do type your questions in the Q&A. You've all mentioned ways of collaborating, which is in itself a skill and sometimes an art. And if you could, Portia talked about her approach to collaborating a bit. I was wondering if Faith, you could speak to your technique of collaboration, what qualities you find are useful to bring to it.
I think there are, I guess, a variety of different techniques. I like that you stated this idea of like collaboration as an art onto itself. I hadn't thought about that, but it definitely is. I think that the primary thing for collaboration, and I think this also speaks to what Portia mentioned about this idea of having trust with institutions in particular, but I think even with your collaborators is the importance of collaborating with people who have kind of like-minded interests, who are invested in the same outcomes as you, have the same values as you, the same mission in doing whatever the work might be, I think is the primary thing. More than anything is to be able to kind of build that trust and have that also accountability to whatever the process is, and whatever the production is also going to be are definitely big things for me.
So accountability and trust, yeah.
And I love that you mentioned the mission and the goals, Faith, because that was something that I think for me, I started to really dig into once I got my fellowship, because not all archives are equal archives, and not all archives have the same goals or missions. And so, I'm part of a community archiving working group, or like a reading group. And one of the questions that, and somebody from Texas A&M University is on there. And I had asked her, I was like, I went to A&M to visit once, and I went to their library and I went to their special collections. And the person there, and I don't remember if it was a student, I do not think it was a staff member, I think it was a student, but that person intentionally reminded me that they had a collection of like Klan memorabilia at Texas A&M. And I was like, that's a really interesting thing to say to a 17-year-old Black girl coming into the archive, trying to figure out if she wants to go here, and it stuck with me. It stuck with me, right? And I ended up not going there, thank God. But I ended up not going there. And, like years later, I thought about that. And so I'm in this community archiving group, and I asked them, I said, hey, do you guys still have that Klan robe? And she goes, oh, we sure do. And I said, do you guys still take things like that? And she was like, we sure don't. And so I just thought like that was a really like profound and remarkable moment, that like an institution that did have a history and relationship with, with racist violence in Texas, decided to, at least at the archival level, make a stand against that, and I thought she's, and she had said, while we haven't disposed of it, we haven't gotten rid of it. It wasn't, they had collected it long before I got here. I will not, and have not collected anything like that ever since. And I just thought that was a really profound moment where you can say like, there is power in the archive, and you do have the ability to shape narratives, and a lot of times people will try to give you things that they feel like are going to tell the story that they want to tell. And I really appreciated the fact that at least in that moment, their special collection said, we're not going to tell that story, and we're not going to give voice to that story anymore, so anyway.
Giving voice to that story, yeah. I was also thinking of how some of what all of you've talked about is related to, what I'm hearing from people involved in community development and community arts development, but more generally community development in terms of asset mapping and how you recognize an asset. And sometimes communities have to be convinced that what they have are assets, that they have assets. And what we all have in us is information as an asset. Have you had experiences like that? I think we tend to, marginalized communities tend to protect what assets they are aware of, and sometimes protect information from a hostile gaze.
So when I was at the Prince George's African American Museum and Cultural Center, we got an IMLS grant to redo our collections, expand it, update paperwork. We found out our collections management system no longer worked, so we had to create an entirely new one and basically start from scratch. But one of the components of that grant and of that project was to do an outreach program called Community Treasure Chest, where we were going to community spaces or programs that were happening all over the county, maybe also outside of the county. There was one spot that was outside of the county, and talk to them about, or we would set up a pop-up museum. So we would bring a couple of objects from our collection, but we would set up a lot of empty space that just had like little acrylic risers on it or something, so that we could encourage people to bring their objects, put them up there. They can take them back, or they can loan them, they can donate them, whatever they wanted to do with it. But we just wanted them to create the museum in that space for the day. And it was interesting to kind of see what they thought, or to hear what they thought we collected versus what we actually collect. We had someone donated a flag from, I think, their friend who died in a war. We had notes from a town meeting or something like that. We had, I think one of our most popular objects was a hot comb, because as soon as everyone would see the hot comb, they would start telling stories of how they were burnt, or the smell of their hair, or how long they had to sit there, and then how the small amount of time that pressed hair lasted, because sweat, humidity, anything was just waiting around the corner to ruin it. So we were able to kind of bring out these stories by showing them we have these, we call them ordinary miracles. We have these ordinary miracles in our collection that you can contribute to, either just for the day or permanently or for a specific amount of time. But I think it kind of opened everyone's eyes to what that museum was actually there for. It wasn't just a place to come and look at art on the walls. It was a lot more than that, hence the cultural center as a part of the title of the institution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Faith, do you want to chime in on that?
It's interesting because when you said this idea of the asset mapping and then how do you protect our assets, I kind of could hear in my head this kind of statement that everybody makes now about data as the new oil, and value of the data and information that we all produce as individuals. And I think that was a big thing for me when I was working through thinking about living data and thinking about collection and data collection in particular, and being very invested in, how do we protect this asset, this, valuable thing that we are all now producing, this data and information that we're kind of putting out into the world, especially through our social media and through the content that we are creating in particular. And I think that's something that I kind of keep coming back to, especially in terms of, I think, the importance of archiving your own things sort of outside of the context of especially different types of platforms that I feel like doing a lot of archival work for us, is this need to protect and value our data and information through actually being maybe a bit more private in the way that we utilize our archives and the way that we collect those things, and also the way that we are going to keeping and curating that information, especially for future generations to come.
Yeah, Synatra notes data that we voluntarily give up and give away via terms and conditions. I mean, I think of the times I don't read any of that stuff, and just because you're in the midst of a task, and okay, whatever it takes for me to get that, my order from some store. So I think too, maybe we should talk a little bit about some of the basics of this that about the algorithms that sort of shape all of this information, and that they are, they have a, we talked a bit about in the first conversation of this series, the aura of authority around archives. And so platforms like Google and Facebook and others have a sort of corporate aura of authority, but they are, their AI is working, is taking in data set, all kinds of data sets that are, I guess, contributing to the formation of algorithms that control whether people get credit cards, bank loans. They shape communities and lives, and they certainly shape opinion about the culture. And, you know, I'm gradually sort of peeling off the layers of my boomer ignorance about this and fear of it. And have you encountered that, had firsthand encounters with that in your work?
So whenever someone mentions algorithms, the first platform that I think of is TikTok, because I am witnessing live how TikTok is changing what they're offering me, what shows up on my For You page. I've somehow entered Caribbean TikTok. I love it. I don't know how I got here, but I don't want to leave. But they are like actively like tweaking things as soon as they see you want to look at this video. Okay, let's find some more just like that. Instagram is pulling from every single place. I think they're pulling from my thoughts. I promise things that I have not said out loud, and then all of a sudden it shows up on my Instagram feed as an ad that I sometimes do go ahead and purchase. I am guilty of that. It's very interesting. And so then it's got me thinking as a curator, okay, so how do I curate what I want the algorithm to offer me? And I had created a brand new page for another company that I work with. We have an app called Trivia Black. It's Black Trivia, and it's on the App Store and Google Play if you want to check it out. I am partially responsible for making the questions, so you can blame me if they're too hard. And so I created the Trivia Black TikTok page, and I said, okay, I'm going to be very intentional about which videos I like, who I follow, because I may not be the only person that sees this. Someone you can see. Well, I don't know how visible it is if other people can see the likes and stuff, but I just wanted to be intentional about what shows up on my For You page, what I'm contributing to. And so after when I went to that page, everything it offers me is Black. And that is not normal for TikTok, because that's one of the critiques of it, that it what do they call it? Shadow something, Black creatives on TikTok. I cannot remember that term, but they're not showing their content. Shadow banning, thank you. They're shadow banning Black creatives on TikTok a lot. So it's very helpful to have people who are like myself, who are going in and purposely looking for that content. The algorithms are insane.
Mm-hmm. Faithe?
I just pulled up, I've been doing just my own personal research on TikTok because, of course, my research primarily is about YouTube, and the YouTube algorithm is what I've studied. And one of my biggest issues always with the YouTube algorithm is the fact that YouTube algorithm, of course, is Google. And so they're not as interested in you as much as they're interested in pushing whatever Google really wants to push. So there's a less attunement to the individual user and more of an investment in what is quote unquote popular, what is mainstream, to the point that even if there are sort of maybe cultural content is a bit more niche that you're interested in, or if it's defined as niche by the algorithm, you won't see that content, regardless of the fact that that might be content that you're interested in. So I always said, I study Black web series. I very rarely see Black web series on my YouTube. Most of the ones that I've ever come to were recommended to me by other people who were interested in them, primarily because that's not how the YouTube algorithm works. But something that I've noticed with TikTok, as Synatra said, it's like the exact opposite. And so there's this interesting relationship. And I think I was writing, I said, TikTok acts as the next generation of community curation, because there's a circular movement from the community actually influencing the content and the type of content that one makes, actually creating specific communities. And so there is this also conscious curation that I think we're all doing, as Synatra also mentioned. We're now, because most of us are very aware, and I said that, you know, consumers are highly attuned now to how the algorithms and recommendation systems work within these different platforms. And so this kind of platform consciousness is also, I think, changing the way that we interact with culture and how we're choosing to curate things, especially to, I think even more so in this day and age as we're dealing with very invasive content with the news media, with advertising, all those different types of things. It's like, what does it look like for all of us to actually become sort of curators of our content, of our feeds, in ways that are actually going to be bringing more content to us that is actually edifying, and more content to us that is actually community minded, that is representative or reflects back the things that we care about and our identities, and less so content that is actually kind of being funneled to us from these larger corporations, industries, and even too from the government as well. I think it's definitely going to be a big conversation as we move forward and start to see even more of these newer platforms.
I'm glad you mentioned the government too, because I was thinking about, and this was when I was still teaching, but we were like gearing up towards the election, and it would be like every day it felt like there was a new ad. And I, at the time I was, this was the let me preface, this was the 2016 election. So this was before the Grim Reaper. It was before then. And so you know, I have the students like research the candidates, understand. And my students would be like, I don't want to click on this, because if I click on this, then all of this other content's going to come to me and I don't want to do it. And so for me, I'm like, okay, that's how an algorithm works. You know, so like, let's have a deeper conversation about big data and how these things work, as opposed to what you don't want to do. Let's have a larger conversation about why it works that way, you know? And so, and I think that Faithe really hit the nail on the head with this, that we are very in tune with how they work now, you know? And I think even, you know, 8 to 10 years ago when I was teaching, we weren't, you know, the students weren't aware of that. They didn't really understand, like, they'd be like, Facebook's following me. And I'm like, it's not, it's actually because you went shopping on this website and, you know, now they're feeding you these ads. But you know, as we're, you know, getting deeper into this 21st century and getting, you know, deeper into this pandemic, to me, like, now these algorithms are going to be all about my self-care. You know, it's like, I don't want to see anything that doesn't feed my soul. And if it's not going to feed my soul, then I don't need to see it, you know? And so if it's going to trigger me, goodbye. And I think that, at least in the little world that I'm living in right now, in my little pandemic world, that's how I'm going to weaponize that algorithm against itself. You know, like, I'm not going to allow an algorithm to tell me what I like. I'm going to tell it what I want it to feed back to me, you know? And I think that has a lot to do with self-care, especially now in these times, you know, when it's so important to be protective of what we're consuming. So
that's an incredible form of resistance. I love that idea. Use the algorithm against itself. We have just a few more minutes. So I wanted to just quickly ask a question about this, the role of social media in what you collect, for example, about an artist. I mean, it used to be press. And so if you were collecting information around a particular individual artist, you might have all kinds of bibliographic resources attached to it in an archive. So how does that work with social media? If that's a question you can answer in 3 minutes, sorry. Or is that, or maybe a question for next time we have this conversation. Synatra, are you looking at social media in your?
It's so funny.
Yeah.
I think so. So I work with Faithe and Portia each on two separate projects. So it's so funny about, collaboration. My fellowship is a collaboration. I collaborate with these two on two different projects. And so the project that I work on with Faithe, the Curated Futures Project, as it's called, which is a collaborative writing project through CLIR. One of the groups, we had some sessions this week, and one of the groups was talking about redefining what scholarship is. I think I had another conversation with someone else too about how we have this narrow understanding of scholarship. And so we need to kind of figure out new ways to cite. If I want to refer to a specific post, not just the handle, but also that specific post, there'd be a wonderful, it would be great to have a way to do that, to say, I got this from Cite Black Women on Instagram, and it's post number 1,245. I don't know. Something like that. Like maybe there could be an archival, like an accession number associated with it, but not accession because it's not. But either way, that would be a really great thing. So I'm not currently doing it. I'm definitely looking at social media. That was how I was able to make my decision between Harriet's Bookshop and the other bookshop for which one I wanted to include in this project. That was the first level of research that I did, but I've never really thought about capturing that part of my decision-making process. I feel challenged to do that now.
Well, it's a subject for another panel, and we have to stop now. I want to thank you three for a wonderful conversation. I've learned so much, and turn it over to Paula to bring us
I
home.
just want to echo your thanks to Portia and Faithe and Synatra. It was so interesting. I took copious notes. I couldn't take them fast enough. And Linda, another really wonderful, substantive, important event. So thank you. And thank you to all of you. It was an honor and a privilege to have you with us today. And I appreciate so much all the great energy that you brought to our conversation.